Welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at DRJ. We thank you for your attendance today and we hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. Everyone's phone has been muted and we ask you to utilize the question panel you'll find on the right hand side of your screen. Our speakers today will attempt to answer as many as possible at the end of the session. Today's sponsor is RockDove Solutions. Today's topic is what about everybody else? Our speakers today are Chris Britton and Jim Satterfield. Chris is the Chief Operating Officer for RockDove Solutions, the developer of the award-winning In Case of Crisis mobile solution. He regularly contributes to industry publications on leveraging emerging technologies in the business continuity, emergency management, and health and safety environment areas. Chris has spent the past 3 decades delivering emerging technology solutions to institutions through leadership roles at AT&T, Rosetta Stone, Interfolio, and prior to coming to RockDove Solutions. Jim is a nationally recognized expert in the field of preparedness and crisis management and has led in the development of national standards for risk management and due diligence. He has spoken to hundreds of groups on risk management, crisis management, governance, and disaster recovery planner, and is the co-author of the book Disaster Ready People for a Disaster Ready America. With no further introductions, I'd like to welcome and turn the mic over to Chris. Chris, you there?
Hi, Chris, if you're on mute, now would be a good time to be unmuted. Well, while we're waiting for Chris, this is Jim Satterfield. We're excited today to be sharing with you to talk about dealing with everyone else and getting them the right information at the right time. And our discussion today will carry us in that direction. Bob,
He is not dialed in at this point. Let me see. He's logged in. I'm sorry, everybody, for the technical difficulty here. We give him a
worked all perfectly just a second ago. And you have the slide deck, do you not, Bob?
I do, so let me go ahead and share my screen real quick.
One of the joys of a live broadcast, everyone, is it's a live broadcast, and the aspects of it make it a little bit more exciting for everyone that's involved. And one of the good things for those of you who work regularly with DRJ, Bob is always on top of everything and has a backup for the backup as we come into it. And I think this is go ahead, Bob.
This is my slide now. Even if Chris can connect back up audio-wise, we'll change the presentation back over to him. So we'll go ahead and proceed, Jim, if you can.
All right. So, Bob, if you're going to drive the slides, if you'll go to the next one. And Bob and I, Chris and I were having a conversation to talk about what about everyone else. You may have your plan, but what about everyone else within the company? What about the people that are in the incident response team? What about your crisis management team? What about the departmental plans? How do all those areas come together? And as we got into it, we got a series of questions that were developed around having questions about what happens in a crisis and how you respond and how you act at every step along the way. And so making that and looking at why some plans fail and some plans succeed, that was the genesis of the discussion that we're having today. As we move to the next slide, Bob, the discussion here is that emergencies are going to happen. We're doing a presentation this week in New Orleans and asking the company, all the people that were in attendance, about how many people they expect to be injured this year. How many people do they expect to die? How many times do they expect to have a problem in a particular area? And the answer is none. Most people aren't thinking of that, but yet they see the plans. And so the question comes back, will your people be ready? And when we think about our employees and responding in a crisis and communicating and dealing with the types of things, people are going to be focused on specific questions as this evolves. What do you do? Where do you go? What do you say? What do you need at those points in time? And that leads to some frustrations as these things start to develop, and they're unclear. And obviously, the lack of certainty will certainly impact us as we go through the operations as we have them. Now, when we think about a crisis, we look at various stages, and Bob, that'll be the next slide as we focus. As a crisis advances, you need different information in each one of the stages. And as we think about it, we see 5 stages that happen in emergencies and crises. There's the pre-action stage, which is before an event has occurred, and that's the training. It's the writing of the plans. It's disseminating the copies. It's the testing the plans, the buying the supplies, having those all together. Then the event occurs, and now we're at onset, and here we're thinking life and safety, and focused around that. You'd activate the emergency response plan, and we'd shelter in place or evacuate or lock down and lock out. The impact assessment comes next, and obviously you first do a high-level look to determine how serious it is, and if it's a significant event, then we're going to activate, declare a crisis and activate our crisis management procedures and activities and plans, and our senior leadership will be moving there. And then as we move from that initial assessment and making those strategic decisions, then we respond to the crisis and activate departmental recovery plans to be able to come together and to restore activities as we would need to get the company back to where we wanted to function. Afterwards, in the post area, we're doing the hot wash. We're determining what worked well, what didn't work well, how we need to operate across that cycle. So at every step along the way, people need access to different plans, to different forms, to different checklists, to different information, and they need it right then because that's when the critical element comes into play. And as we think about today dealing with it, we're going to go back and look at this in a little bit more depth as we come together. So, Bob, if you'll move us to the next slide.
Yes, and I'm just checking real quick if Chris is logged back on.
I'm here, folks. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfectly now. We missed you. We're glad you're back, Chris.
I am happy to be back. Absolutely. And thank you, Jim, for taking the opportunity to get us started successfully and on time. I very much appreciate that. Just to dovetail where Jim left off, we're looking at the agenda for today based on the conversation we're having, and these are some of the questions we want to be able to address today in the webinar. What is coming? How do you know what you don't know? Why do plans fail? How do your people know what to do when? And looking at the next generation of an emergency flip book. With that in mind, Jim, how do we predict a crisis?
Well, obviously that's the question that we all are as we think about the business continuity professionals that are on the phone today and working within your companies and organizations. Leadership is looking at you to help them identify what the next crisis will be. And clearly in a world today we can as we think about that. But to go today, we do vulnerability and risk assessments. We'll do a hazard impact matrix. We'll do a threat analysis as we carry forward. If we're dealing with areas like workplace violence, we'll be focused around behaviors of concern and evaluating them. If it's natural disasters like the weather, we certainly can follow the weather reports, and we've seen significant storms this year already moving across the center of the country and out to the northeast, disrupting not only operations at those locations, but within the supply chain areas. And finally, in creating intelligence networks and looking and seeing what's going on within that organization that would suddenly trigger knowing what's occurring. So yes, we can, and I think senior management is looking at all of us in each of our jobs to be focused there. And as we see with some of those words behind can you identify your organization's next crisis, we see the types of things that could suddenly come forward that might be a little different than we thought. The business crisis risk, lawsuits, social media, liquidity, I see the business continuity world, as we've talked about in other webinars and at the DRJ conference and the one coming up at Springworld. We'll be dealing with the types of impacts that we need to be identifying in advance. So I think the answer, Chris, as we talked about, is yes, we can, and more importantly, we're being held accountable within our organizations to, in fact, do that. The next slide, I think, leads us on to continue that conversation. So the only way that we can identify that next sign is to focus on what the warning signs are. And fortunately, our experiences that we've each had in all of our companies as we've gone through, you've got a list that you're looking for. And learning about those indicators, those warning signs that are there, can certainly tell us about what's coming next in the development and moving forward. This becomes a part of the culture of the company, and how do we create a culture of preparedness? And that's a topic that I know that Bob has directed and led several webinars as we focused on it and going in the past. But what our research shows us, when we go back and look at the crises that Firestorm has been called on to assist in, that there were always indicators. And whether somebody says, well, you know, this never seemed right, or that person was never quite what we expected, or we didn't have the level of control that we were indicating. And so those patterns really shape both the severity, how bad it is, and the frequency, how many times that those would occur. So there is great value in identifying the indicators. So look at the warning sign, and then understanding what the trigger is that says this is about to occur. That's the fundamental beginning point as we think about going through and planning in those areas. Yes, we can predict the next crisis, but it takes this type of focus, because if you knew about the next crisis before it happens, then the answer to those questions, what do we do now, what do we say, what do we need, become much clearer, and the following of your plans will be supported on a much higher level.
And Jim, what is a process that one would follow? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're going to lead me into my next slide with that, and that's quite helpful to carry us forward. We think about this with a predict, plan, perform process. And the predict area is understand what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what are their impacts, how do you monitor them, and then what are the specific triggers. This monitoring and the triggers become extremely important as we associate this with the warning signs and the indicators that are there. The plans, whether we're talking about communicable illness or business continuity or crisis management or workplace violence, all then are based upon that foundation. In a business continuity area, obviously the driving process of the business impact analysis fills a great many of those holes for us as we carry through. The perform side is the training, the exercise, the testing, the getting the plans printed and disseminated, making sure that they're available. And then finally the crisis management as that element comes in place. So I think it's critical for all of us to have a structure as we think about the planning process of predicting what will occur next to better understand it.
And Jim, I noticed that your arrow at the bottom goes in both directions. And from my perspective, it implies and seems intuitive to think of this as an ongoing, always happening thing at each of those stages.
And this is a continuous improvement process. For those of you who have inherited a program within your organization, you're continually enhancing, you're improving, you're building it. You've laid a foundation of where you are and where you want to go. And the hot wash that we talked about at the end of it in that post area will give us indications of new things for us to monitor, new triggers that have been identified, new details of the planning that need to be in place. Because there will always be challenges in this process. It's not a once and done, I wrote a plan 10 years ago and it's in great shape. Not going to be happening. This is a continuous improvement process.
And at the perform level, it means that the employees, the people that are involved, suppliers, need to be constantly refreshed on what's going on and trained and tested.
And Chris, when you and I were talking over the last week or two about what we were going to talk about today, that having the right information at the right time just seems to be a recurring theme about this as we go into more and more detail of this particular aspect of it. So I think that leads us into the next question, if I'm not mistaken, and how do you know what you don't know? And this is the beginning of what we were talking about in that predict phase and carrying it forward. And I think we're all going to be, we find ourselves today in an area where you have to create your own intelligence network. You know what's going on within your company, and you're seeking to do that. You've set up those types of aspects of it to come together to understand. What we're finding today is that there are new sources of information that are traditionally not in the existing business continuity programs from an intelligence network standpoint. And one of those would be the monitoring of social media and social media risk that's out there. What we're finding is that what's on social media today will occur tomorrow. And that way we should look at this, because we're seeing regulators now, in particular industry groups, mandating that there be a social media risk program in place within the organizations. And that's pretty well defined best practices now, that we see the migration of this across a much broader base to include within this area. And if you break this down into two elements of listening and looking, and this is probably a little different terminology than maybe some of you have thought of in the past. Listening is that kind of a broad conversation to see what's being said about an organization. We'd look at streams, and streams are made up of phrases. Phrases are made up of words, and it gives us a general situational awareness of what's going on. Many times there are folks within your organization or within the public that will have information that will become very important to you. And then once you've found an area, then you want to go back and look. And this is where we start to look more specifically at a specific location, an event, or a person. You can identify a sphere of influence that this person might have. You have the ability to do geocoding around a location and go back even in time and look at what's been reported before and earlier in that area. In looking at a client that we're working with, a Fortune 10 company, we took one of their centers and set up a geofence around it, and were able to identify an employee there who had done 80 postings in one 8-hour shift. By the way, he was making comments that he didn't have a lot to do, and I guess that's obvious if you have enough time to do 80 postings on shift. And he then indicated that he was having a problem with his supervisor. He shared that this could potentially be a racial problem. And in his last posting of the day, he made a statement, well, the only way I'm going to resolve this is I'm bringing a gun to work tomorrow. And when we think about this, think of the power of being able to know that before that gun actually comes to work. And so as we see the word crisis here, and I know we're going to be focusing on emergencies and plans, but when it happens to you, it certainly is a crisis. It's that danger and opportunity symbol coming together. And it's a risk event for which there's not been one has not identified the vulnerabilities and exposures. You don't have a developed plan, and therefore does not know how to respond. So having the right plan in the right person's hand seems to me to be one of the most critical aspects we can, so that this is how we begin to learn what we don't know. So that was a long conversation to get us to that point, and I think just to maybe reinforce two elements around it. One is before the event we have a tool, and that looks a lot like a calendar. As we think about the next slide, Chris, it shows that we've got a lot of time to be able to pull these things together. But the problem is, once these events start, we shift to another tool, and that's where that watch starts to come forward through the calendar. And it tells us that we now are dealing in seconds, not days, not weeks. Whether this is a compliance-driven effort that you have to do, or you've got a key customer, or whether it's a threat like the man that was going to bring a gun to work tomorrow to deal with an HR issue within the organization. We have to have that ability to adapt in those directions. That's really where plans fail. When someone needs that information, when time is really urgent and they can't exercise it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Chris, I think we've talked a little bit about that, but I think we ought to spend more time talking about why do plans fail and what are the common themes that we see around those. And as we bring up the list on the next slide, I think we ought to just take a moment about these. We've seen these 5 common failures traced back every time that we go back into an emergency, a disaster, crisis, and working with an organization. The largest single failure is failure to control critical supply chains. Today, we all only own 10 or 15% of our supply chain. That gives us a dependency of 85 to 90% on third parties. And have you identified who your critical vendors are? Have you looked at their plans? Are you integrated with them in that process? Second is training employees for working at home. 70% of employees don't know what to do, and 95% don't have a plan at home. That 70% that don't know what to do at work, that's getting your emergency plan into their hands. At least then they would have that information to be able to do it and to respond. Third is failure to identify and monitor all the threats and risk. And we're seeing some of the big things obviously dealt with. If you're dealing with somebody in California and they're thinking about earthquakes, or the Gulf Coast, perhaps hurricanes, or the Northeast, the winter storms. But tornadoes and flooding and other things can certainly come into play quickly that would carry forward.
Well, and just to highlight a few points here, 3.2 million work-related injuries and illnesses occur each year, and over 500,000 violent crimes are reported in the workplace in the U.S.
And those are staggering numbers. And what happens is most organizations get lulled into a thing, well, it hasn't happened here, so it's not going to happen. This is the thing that happens to that other guy, as we talked about at the beginning of the area. And one of the common failures here is this word monitor on that third line down. We see people that have identified some of the things, Chris, that you're talking about, but they're not monitoring and looking at intelligence network to see that element starting to come. Fourth is failure to conduct exercises and update plans. If you don't test your plans, you don't know that they're going to work and do. And keeping them updated, how often have we found plans where the indication is the person is no longer with the company, or their phone number has changed, or it doesn't cover that function anymore? And then lastly, the developing a crisis communications plan. What are your 3 key messages to each one of your stakeholder groups for each one of the vulnerabilities and threats that you've identified? So our plans fail because we don't put these elements in place, because if we know these are repeated over and over again, that's where the problem comes in. This starts to build a pattern then that you've got to spell out all of the details and get those details to the right people. Not everyone needs to see every one of your plans. They only need to see the portion that relates to them and their job or their department. So Chris, did you want to add anything onto these 5?
Yeah, I think you covered it well. I mean, I would not underemphasize the importance of conducting exercises and doing updates to plans. I think one of the biggest challenges is, even if the plan is developed, oftentimes employees are not aware of it and don't know where to find it.
Well, if I can't get it, I can't use it.
That's right.
So why do plans fail? Let's talk about what's going on as the events are starting to occur. And there were a bunch of reasons that came out of the notes that I had from our conversation the other day as we were going on it. And let's just talk about some of these as we frame it. First of all, in a crisis or an emergency or disaster, there's just an escalating flow of events. Things are happening quickly, and that creates a particular problem because this is all moving so fast, and it starts out as minor and moves to moderate, and then all of a sudden we're severe as it starts to unfold. You want to talk a little bit about information?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, one of the frustrating things, and we alluded to it a little bit on the last slide, is the fact is a lot of the information that employees need is not available to them at the time of the crisis. And then what happens is they revert to word of mouth or third parties to guide them. And you know, even if they do get an alert, it's often lacking details that are much needed, and leaves an organization in a very unique challenge.
And I think that, as you pointed out, the flow of events, most of what you learn immediately is wrong. And then you've got to decide what you want to send out and to share, because obviously we're under intense scrutiny. People want to know what to do. They want to know that they're going to be safe, that the work environment is all right, that the company will survive, or what the impact is associated with it. Family members are going to want to know, are my loved ones okay? And after the event, there's going to be Monday morning quarterbacking. You know, just think about all the conversations we've had this week about why didn't they run the ball? Why did they throw the ball with extra plays left and a timeout, and the game was lost? And that type of scrutiny happens every single time there's a disaster or an emergency within your organization.
And that just ties right into command and control, because what then happens is people start to question the leadership, the management, and furthermore, you have employees talking with the media or executing their own plans as best they know, and leaving the organization in a precarious position.
And that brings us back, because it suddenly comes as a surprise. Every one of us has a job. When somebody comes running into our office to tell us something, invariably, given the nature of business continuity and crisis management, it's not good news. They're coming to you with a problem, with an issue that happens in that area. I tell people the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. If you're at work and in our business, a surprise isn't going to be good, it's going to be bad.
No, and Jim, as a crisis consulting practitioner, I'm sure you've had some firsthand experiences with how a simple crisis turns into another crisis, which can be even larger and more difficult to navigate. Do you have any thoughts on examples of that?
Well, it's interesting. We're just prior to our webinar today, we're dealing with a school that's having a crisis. And they want to send a message out to everybody, and they don't know all the facts, and they don't know everything that's happened. And so trying to keep that message waiting until we know the correct answer makes a big difference. You don't want to upset parents. You don't want to activate problems prematurely. You want to be able to have a specific area. But if you think about the plan area, and let's go back to whether it's an emergency plan or a departmental recovery plan, if that's laid out in advance and I've got the information, then we know that people are going to do what we need them to do and not something else. And responding in the incorrect way, or not responding at a time when they really need to, can easily create a second crisis as this thing gets a little bit more out of hand in an accelerated way. So those are all the reasons that I think we came to about why plans fail. Let's summarize them real quickly, if we could, Chris, and give them a little bit of an idea of what that laundry list would look like on the next slide. Well, if you don't have a plan, it's going to fail. I'm still amazed at the number of companies today that don't have plans, that they're incomplete, that they've got some procedures, but it's not been integrated. We looked at one company, and they had identified 12 different groups by different names across all the plans. So it was just really not integrated and not complete. No one knew who was going to be responsible for what needs to be done. Most of the plans that you would look at, and I would encourage you to go back and look at those plans within your company, they probably are fairly clear on what to do, but they might not be clear on how to do it. If you can take an employee and they can read your plan and they know exactly how to do what you want them to do, that's a good plan. If it looks there and says, do this, but doesn't tell them how, then the plan doesn't become actionable.
Well, Jim, that's a great example. I mean, a lot of people have everyday jobs, and they don't involve emergency procedures and guidelines. So the how is essential in order for them to take a situation where there's zero time to react and to activate and move forward.
We review plans on a regular basis as part of what we do in working. And the next two items are almost universally weak across the plans that we look at. There hasn't been any training and there hasn't been any testing. Well, if you don't train your people, how can you expect them to perform on your plan? And if you don't test it, you're not going to find out where those problems are. The last two are also grouped together, and I think that, Chris, this is an area that we're going to talk a lot more about today, and that's the, hey, I got a plan, it's a binder, wait a minute, it was on the shelf over there, wait, it's not on the shelf. Where is it? They can't find it. And particularly when someone's under duress and under pressure, that's invariably the time I have the hardest time of finding something.
Yeah, I was just going to dovetail, Jim. One comment I would make is an example of this, and is often overlooked, is the internet and cellular service go down. They're simply not reliable when you have a major crisis on your hands.
So getting access and getting that access to the plan available when you need it, getting it in time instead of hours later. Loss of power, loss of cell towers, loss of internet are all very common in large disasters and crises that have come into play. So it's a different world today for us to plan and operate in than it was just a few years ago. So as we've now talked about why plans fail, let's start to talk about how do our people know what to do when. And everybody should be very comfortable with what you're seeing on the screen at this point, thinking about the various aspects of this, and this is what you're doing. Identifying what the risks and threats are, putting the plans in place, doing that, having departmental buy-in, creating the document here and documenting those aspects, getting the supplies in place, training your people, exercising, and then giving them access to it. This is really what's going to help people to know what to do when, if all of these elements are present and available for them to operate at any particular point. But if you take one or two of these away, the likelihood of a failure escalates exponentially. And that's an area for us to think about today as we come in. And I think we want to look a little historically of what you can do when and in other ways that's been communicated. The next slide, I think, shows what a lot of us are very familiar with, and that's the flip books that are out there. And I included a couple of photoshops, pictures here of from Wellspring. Wellspring prints these up for those of you who want to have them printed, and they certainly serve a role. And these can be larger or smaller, but you've got immediate access to see a tab, flip it open, and it tells you what to do. And I would imagine most all of us on the call at one time or another have created various versions of these types of documents, and that's a way to let people know what to do when. I really don't expect to have a CEO or a CFO have their crisis management plan in a flip book, though. I think they're looking at different things. You certainly aren't going to do your departmental recovery plans this way, but emergency plans certainly can work in that direction, but they have to have that plan with them. And if they don't, that could be a particular problem. The next slide really relates to, in addition to that supply work we talked about earlier. You can have plans, but if you don't have the supplies that you need, and they're obviously different from one disaster zone to another, and so specific kits that could be distributed to the employees in advance or even stored in areas where the storage facility could be just outside your building. And then that gives you a potential command center or a medical center that you can use inside the facility. And I mentioned Nexus here. They do a phenomenal job at designing preparedness systems and coming into play there. So I think having the flip book, having the supplies certainly are going to be a key aspect. But let's go a little bit more into some of the other items that were on the previous slide, and that leads us into, I think, talking about time. And what all the plans do are to give you the time when it matters most. You don't have time to sit down in the middle of that crisis and write this plan up. You need to be able to carry forward. So you end up with some choices of what do you do at this point in time. You could just follow what others do. If you're at work and there's a problem and people are moving down the hall and they're going to a particular exit, you could just fall into line and go through and out that particular area. You could have a written plan, but if the sprinklers are going off overhead and that's in a binder and it's getting wet, certainly not going to do you a lot of good associated with it. You could have training, and the more training and exercising, and those go hand in hand together, that's certainly an element. Having a bullhorn certainly can help because, again, if the power's out, at least then you can get voice commands and coordinate outside of that. And there, as we all know, there are many notification systems that are out there today, and they do a great job at getting voice messages and emails and text messages out to folks. Those are all ways that we can maximize those activities and coming together. But I think up to this point, we've spent a lot of time, Chris, talking about what's been here now. I think we ought to shift the direction and start to think about what needs to be coming next. What's the next generation in thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. And I think here, when we look at a new approach, it's all about getting the right plan information in the hands of the right people at the right time in a way that is both confidential but yet doesn't rely on some of the traditional infrastructure that we know can be a challenge, or printed documents that often aren't accompanying the individuals that need to act. And so with that in mind, go to the next slide. Let's take a look at some things that are going on here. And Jim, why don't I let you start, and I can chime in as well.
Well, Chris and I have been in discussions now over the last several months and talking about what's the common things that everyone has, because we all don't carry free-rein binders around with us everywhere we go for each one of our departmental plans or our emergency plans. And while we're talking about emergency flip books here, I just want you to insert in your mind in that upper right-hand corner that we're talking about all types of plans. And one of the things that became apparent that Chris pointed out is that everybody has a smartphone today. Now, that was certainly not true a decade ago as we thought about this. People had cell phones, but they were not smartphones. But if you've got that aspect there and that phone with you, if we can get the plans, the flip books, the departmental recovery plans, the crisis management plans, where they're fully stated on that device that everybody's got in their pocket, because if I'm running out of the building, I'm going to grab my phone on the way out of the building. That's a device or a tool that I would have with me within it. And then that'll lead us to the second question that we'll talk about in a moment. What happens if suddenly there's not cell towers? I got my phone, but there's no cell communication that's coming around. So, Chris, you were sharing some of the details that you've been able to document, and I thought they were very impressive about the fact that how close the phone is and how often it's checked. Do you want to share those?
Yeah, and I think we've got it here on the screen. Literally today, the statistics say that the average smartphone user now keeps that phone within 3 feet of themselves 24 hours a day, that they look at it while awake every 6 minutes, and that if they get a push notification, they typically check it within 10 seconds, which, what a great medium when you know they're walking out the door with it in a crisis. And then you combine to that, the smartphone itself has changed a lot of the behavior already in our society. You know, when you look at common things like banking and communication And simple things like alarm clocks and TV remotes, everything is shifting into smartphone mode. So really, as we see the smartphone, we see a great opportunity to create the next generation emergency flip book. And if we could go to the next slide.
And let me just jump back in one comment, because I want to underscore something that you're saying on that slide that I think sometimes we miss. And that's that this device allows us to download that plan, whether the internet is up or not, that you've got that plan right on that device at that point in time. So with no cell tower, no internet, you still have the plan in the hand of the person who needs it at that moment in time. I'm sorry, Chris, but I just want to make sure that everybody understood that's really where this thing has led us into the next generation.
Absolutely, and by that, it creates that 24/7 access always. So that because the smartphones, their plans are instructional and actionable, and can be segmented easily, it creates a very unique opportunity for institutions and organizations to prepare their employees with a very actionable two-way communication, localized plan approach that heretofore just was not possible.
And I think the list that you listed there is pretty comprehensive. Whether it's emergency plans or incident forms and checklists, crisis management plans, communicable illness, the plans can be there so that each of those four people could be using their device and looking at the plan that's applicable to them, as opposed to all only seeing a flip book that says exit through the stairwell at the end of the hall. So this is a new generation for us to think about, and I think that we're all challenged in each of our jobs in the companies that we're in is what can we do and where can we go to carry this forward. And one of the things that I think that's happened today with the breakthroughs in technology and capacity, and the economics are certainly more possible today. In discussions with Chris, I was surprised to learn that you can have this available to your employees for less than the cost of a flip book. So you can give the right plans or multiple plans to the right people for less than what you're paying for to create flip books. So this is the next generation. This is where we are and where we're carrying forward, and certainly as we look forward on it. We also wanted to talk just a little bit more, I think, Chris, about testing of plans, and since that's a common failure in testing in this information area. And the next slide talks a little bit about why we all test plans, and I think everybody would be in general agreement that that's a fairly good list for us, and it identifies the weaknesses, locate the errors. We all would rather fail during a test than during a live area. It gets buy-in. If people go through and have experienced it, they certainly understand. We were involved today with doing a test exercise with a school in a South American country to let them go forward. And they were concerned about kidnap and ransom, and it was a way to get a buy-in there within the organization to focus on it. And then you take the lessons that are learned in the exercise and go back and update the plans. So as we think about this, I think we're at a point now where we need to be thinking about how do we test our plans and focus on access to information within it. As we move on and talk about that, we see a list of things then to think about when you're designing it. And I think limiting the scenario specifically around it with specific objectives to evaluate particularly the access to the plans and procedures. Have you tested that your people can get to the documents that they need to at the time they need to do that? Obviously, you can do some enhancements and changes and messages through the exercise. Having a more formal evaluation afterwards, a survey could be utilized, or it could be a formal hot wash to come together. And as we have all done planning, we know that it takes time to set that up in advance. That limiting this type of an access exercise to something like 90 to 120 minutes with a series of escalations in it will work well, and limit the debriefing to 30 minutes. That would be a recommendation to tie within it. The cycles come and go as we move through the plans and testing it, but think about designing this year one of your exercises focused primarily on the word access. I think you'll be surprised at what you'll find is happening within your organization. And then the next slide really continues that discussion a little bit as we think about it, about the hot wash and the follow-up and review and evaluation. Providing feedback, reinforcing the actions that you wanted to see and to come together. Note those issues of command, control, coordination, and communications. Where did those fall apart? And it comes back, I think, to be thinking about what this next generation of plans look like. No one's going to carry their laptop out into the rain trying to figure out what to do. But they've got that phone with them, and if the plan is there, that would certainly help. And then getting this comment back from everyone will certainly tie this together. And that's really the purpose for the hot wash and the debriefing and coming in place. Chris, I know that you've helped thousands of people, and I think you had indicated over 250,000 people are doing this now and looking in it. Anything else from the testing or the evaluation of what's happened that you want to share with us at that point?
I think the big thing is that, as you described earlier on about the process, that testing is a way to validate what you're doing, but it's also a way to adjust and fine-tune, and having plans that can be easily updated and easily shared with your employees is critical. And I think the next generation approach to plans is to have something that's very iterative and easy to share, and to give each of those folks the how, when, and where they need it.
Well, I think we're all faced with how we bring value back to our organizations. And one of the things, if we keep doing the same thing the same way, we're going to relive the same experiences. And when things fail, we're going to be doomed to repeat those on and on. I think today, with technology and the role that it's playing, it's time for us to go back and think about how can our plans be different than they were in the past? How can we get the right plan to the right person at the right time? And that takes all the same planning that we've been doing, creating it, but we have to think about it into new channels. You go to dinner with a couple of teenagers sitting at the table, and you find that they're going to be texting back and forth through the entire meal, even passing the salt with a request of that message going back instantly from one to another. We're raising a culture of people that are used to that device being the controlling element in their life. If you're still dealing back into a printed piece of paper, even in a flip book or in a different format, you're dealing with solving this generation's problems with the problems from with the solutions from previous generations. I think we've evolved to a different level. This is an area that you need to be testing within your plans. Testing as we see the cultural changes that occur and having them available. If you have a bilingual company, then you could even create versions of this in the languages that you need. So if you've got a large Spanish group of employees, then they can have their plans in Spanish on their phone, while the person next to them has the same plan in English. We're in a different world today, and we haven't fully recognized that as business continuity professionals. And I think now's the time for us to think about carrying it forward in that direction. So there's a lot of things that have been happening. There's been a falling price. There's been an expansion of technology, and the emergence of the smartphone with storage capacity gives you the ability now to have the right plan in the right person's hands at the right time. Those are all things that I would encourage you to think about as you look through to plan in that direction. So, Chris, any other comments you want to make before we see if there are some questions that we need to address?
No, Jim. First of all, let me say we are very thankful for your participation, your experience in today's discussion. We're also thankful for Bob and the folks at DRJ for giving us this opportunity to share with you all this information, and look forward to, I believe, Jim, you all as well as us are both going to be at the DRJ conference in Orlando, and so feel free to reach out to us either there or you can call us direct. You see the contact information here for both Firestorm and RockDove Solutions, and we certainly welcome your questions both here on the phone now and as we go forward. Again, thank you to everybody. Let's go ahead now and open up for questions at this time, Bob.
Wonderful. We do have several questions here submitted, and thanks everyone for their patience here today. We had a little technical difficulty, so it's not our usual process, but I think we're making do. So the questions here submitted will start. Oops, I just lost that. Will you please repeat the social media quote regarding today versus tomorrow?
The quote that I said earlier was, "What's on social media today will be here tomorrow." We're seeing regularly the comments and observations that are being shared among people in a public domain. We're not talking NSA and hacking into areas, but it's out circulated and commented. And let's just go down one line to emphasize that. The statistics are staggering, where when you had a workplace violence episode and you have an active shooter or an armed intruder, the statistics are that over 80% of the time someone else knew. And the person that knows, they're talking about that on social media. And the statistics even go further to say that over 2/3 of the time, 2 or more people know. And so when that information starts to surface, it's surfacing first in social media. That's the intelligence network that you have to create. And if you'd like to know more about that, we certainly can share that with you in another webinar at the DRJ. But you need to have a formal social media risk monitoring program as part of your business continuity department within your organization. It's great to monitor social media for marketing and sales to find out if the ad campaign's working or the new direct mail piece is great. Those are very effective. But the risks are shown today on social media. So what occurs today on social media, you'll see tomorrow.
All right, wonderful. How do you recommend approaching employees about personal preparedness at home? Should it be done with the emergency plans for the workplace, separate, or some other example?
Well, family trumps job. If you're forcing me to choose between my family and my job, I'm going to pick my family every time. So if you link what you're doing back over to the having a plan at home, and you could take your flip book at work and talk about, let's have a home version associated with that, I would encourage you to have a plan at home, get your employees thinking about the risk and threats that they have at work, and would be a good opportunity to carry forward there. By the way, that same type of planning could be put on the same smartphone that we were talking about as we've been discussing this presentation.
All right, another great question. How do you secure the... Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, just to dovetail what Jim was saying, personal resilience is critical. And we talked earlier about testing. One of the things that's often overlooked in the testing process is how reliable the assumptions are of what resources are going to be available, because often first responders and others are going to be taking care of their personal family and their own safety when a crisis hits. So personal resilience is not to be underestimated.
All right, great question here on how do you secure the plan, as many continuity plans are sensitive.
So let me take that one, Jim. So within the mobile device, applications like ours have the ability to manage security such that you can partition employees versus non-employees, certain employees versus other employees, and have that ability to secure it so that only the right folks are having access to the information that you want to make available. And in our version, for example, we now have a secure PIN that can be used so that even the right employee with the right phone has to enter a PIN in order to get to it. And we even include things like auto removal when the employee leaves the organization. So again, the company is able to not only give the information out, but retract the information if they need to when an employee leaves.
All right. Any suggestions on how to monitor social media?
That's a long conversation, but I think the trick here is, first of all, it's not a Google search. It's there are several tools out there that range from hundreds of dollars a month to thousands and even $10,000s of dollars a month. Each tool has strength and weakness in coming together, and I would encourage you to divide it into this general listening trend area, and that's a separate kind of a tool than a tool that is really going after a specific geographic location or a specific individual and carrying forward. I know that we've got hundreds of people on the call today, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation by talking about that. Chris and I have agreed that we're going to try to reach out to everybody that's on the phone today to answer their calls afterwards in their questions. And Bob does a great job of catching all the ones that have come in writing, and so we'll do that. But when we give you a call, then we'll be certainly glad to spend as long as you need to have those details shared.
All right. Some IT disaster recovery plans have architectural diagrams of different environments. How big or little can be transferred to a smartphone?
No, that's a great question. I mean, we can handle a number of different visualizations in our app. As far as the smartphone, you know, the practical limitations are simply the amount of memory that you want to take up on a smartphone device. We've come up with ways to optimize and to work with light images. However, you know, again, it depends on the workflow and what you're trying to do.
All right, wonderful. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. If we did not get to your questions today, Jim and Chris will have access to all the questions that's submitted today, and we'll follow up, as Jim mentioned earlier, with you after the webinar has ended. Any parting words here today, Jim or Chris?
I just wanted to make sure that everybody that's on the call, these types of webinars are great learning opportunities, and I encourage you to catch all the DRJ webinars through the course of the year. But the best way to come is to come to Spring World, sit down, you can talk to your peers that are in other companies, you can meet with the vendors, you can look at the products and get demonstrations. I've been extremely impressed by what I've seen out of RockDove Solutions and the In Case of Crisis. I think it solves the problems that our people have of not being able to get to the right plan at the right time at the right. And that is the key issue. And as we think through those areas. So thank you for what you're doing within your firms. Thanks for all the help that you've given. Thanks for your commitment to our industry as we're all striving to be better.
And just as a sponsor, I want to thank everybody involved, and we certainly look forward to visiting with each and every one of you at the DOJ conference or directly by phone.
Certainly, wonderful. Thanks for the plug on Spring World, guys. So, thanks again, everyone here for their attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Chris and Jim for their time here today, as well as RockDove Solutions for sponsoring today's webinar. RockDove will be emailing everyone a link to the recording of this webinar. You may view it as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal, Firestorm, or RockDove there. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar.